All right, so let's talk about state setup and teardown. So as I mentioned earlier, right, what we like to be able to do is to test our components in a controlled environment. We want to make sure that if we know what the initial state is, and that component is subject to certain inputs, right, to certain stimulation, right, we know that the output should be whatever, right? That we know if you have this input, right, with this event, then the output should be X, right? And we would like to be able to compare and make sure that whatever the expected value matches the actual value, right? And then we can say, okay, well, functionally, it's working well. If they're the same, right, it's behaving as expected as a specification. So a common technique to accomplish this is referred to as setup and teardown. Right? Basically, we want to be able to put our unit tests in kind of like a sandwich, right? Where there's or in a parenthesis that they're always going to be preceded by a processing that sets the stage where our unit test is going to be tested. Right? There's going to be a setup step, making sure that the state is that the component is in the right state, in the correct state. Then we generate our stimuli, right, on our unit, on our component under test, and then we compare the resulting output to see if it's the correct output that we were expecting. Right? Once the test has occurred, typically it won't be just one test. Usually it will be multiple tests. Right? And so typically, before we go to the next test, we want to make sure that any side effects that might have lingered on from previous tests, that they don't dirty or that they affect the next test. Make sure? Make sense? So typically, we want to clean up after whatever test we just completed. Right? And typically, this step is referred to as a teardown. Right? So typically, that's, again, it's a technique for isolating these tests. We created a known state. We test and effects. Right? Somebody might they might be leaving an array that is too long or too short, or maybe the previous test changed a bit the local variables, and that would dirty the next test. So we want to make sure to just throw away anything that the previous test might have done, so that we clean up and we don't influence the next test. Make sense? Okay. So, for instance, there are different ways of isolating the different tests. The most common one is that a test suite might contain multiple tests, right? 10, 20, 30 tests, and we want to make sure that each test executes in isolation with all the other tests, right? That perhaps even that the particular order in which these tests occur, they should not at all influence each other. So it doesn't really matter if I execute test 2 first and then test 1, right? It should not matter, right? Because these all should execute in isolation. So typically, what we do is that we put the test like in a sandwich, right, where we have a layer that runs before each test, right? That sets up the stage for the test. The test runs, and as the test is running, it might make changes to the state or any local variables and whatnot. And then you have what is called a teardown, right? That just cleans up of whatever residual side effect that the test might have done, and then we do the setup again. Right? We run the next test, and then we do a teardown. Right? So this is very common. Right? We have a teardown and a setup and a teardown. Now notice that this is referred to as a setup for each and a teardown after each, meaning these execute for every test. They execute right before every test and right after every single test. Okay, in that order. Now sometimes there might be certain states that you do consider that should be used by all the tests. Okay, that indeed you want to verify that. You want to break it up in such a way that you do want to see what the side effects might be from one test to the other, right? Where you do want to take into account those kinds of things. So you might decide that I don't really want to set up the state every single time. Right? I can set up certain things that are only set up just once. Maybe something that is very, very expensive. Maybe some database access that makes no sense to query it every single time. Right? That you might query only once. Keep it in memory. Maybe you have a read-only access, right? That there's no way that you could update it and litter the test and have any side effects, right? Maybe you load it and it's a constant once you've loaded it. So there's no way that any test would dirty or somehow have side effects. So there's also the possibility of setting up the state before all the tests run, right? And then you would run all the tests, and then at the end you would clear out and clean up after yourself, right? Maybe you have some files open, maybe you have some database connections open, maybe you have certain resources that you need to release, right, after the end of the test. Okay, this is very common if you have integration tests that literally would need to actually hit some kind of network or some remote resource or some database where it's very expensive to create the resource and throw it away and recreate it again and throw it away for every single test. The other case is that you can do a mix and match of both, right? Where you can have some of these things occurring before everything, right? And then you can have each test perhaps running with a setup and a teardown for every single test, or even grouping the tests, right? Where you set up for each, but then you group several tests that you want to run that share that same scope. Right? So the setup for each here is setting up a scope or setting up a scenario where all these tests should be executed in a particular sequence, right? And then you tear down after that particular test, and so on and so forth. Again, lots of options, right, on how is it that you can configure. You might want to configure these tests depending on the dependency between all these different tests. Okay. Now here I'm going to talk about Jest. Right? Jest is a library that we introduced last week before we left for the break. But these concepts apply also to JUnit and Karma, Jasmine. If whatever library, whatever test library you're using, you're likely to find similar concepts of implementing the same kind of ideas. In Jest that we started covering last week, we have the capability of setting up and tearing down either before all the tests that are invoked. So for instance, you can call the before all function. That function will be called at the beginning when the test suite runs. At the beginning of every single test. Now, before any test executes, that function executes. And then you have after all, right? That's a function that will execute at the very end when every single test has finally executed. Right, so that's being able to set up a scope for all the tests and then tear down the scope for all the tests, and then you can set up also a before each and an after each, which will be invoked before every single test, and then the tear down will be invoked right after every single test. So here's an example, a really quick example, where we might be setting up loading some database access that typically might be very, very expensive, right? That we need to connect to a remote database and load the data. Typically, you might want to do just this once. And so, for instance, here in the before all function, we're calling this initialized city database, right? So we're setting up maybe some huge JSON object that we're loading only once, very expensive, and then after we've loaded it, all the tests run, right? So for instance, here we have two tests that are validating that the two cities of San Juan and Vienna, that they're both in this database that we just loaded, right? Are they in the database? Yes, they're in the database. So we did a kind of like a smoke test, right, to verify that these particular cities are in the database, right? And once we're done, we can throw away the database. We don't want to keep the network or the connection to a database up and running, so we clear it out. Or here we're doing it before each test. So here we're very, very expensive. Right? Loading the database for every single test, we're reloading and then throwing it away after every single test. Okay. Here's another example. Here's an example that where we can group multiple tests, right? As opposed to we might want to load something that is specific to several tests that share a common scope. For instance, here this shows some syntax that allows us to group by using the function called describe. Right? Describe is a way of grouping multiple tests. Right? It's just a function which looks very much like a test. Right? It has a title. Right? But the function can house multiple tests. Notice the describe is a function, right? There it is, the function. And internally, you have two tests running in here. Testing that Vienna loves sausages and then San Juan loves plantains. And you're verifying that that's true, that Vienna loves Wiener Schnitzel and San Juan loves mofongo. Right, and verifying that this indeed is true. Right, so those two tests are treated as one single thing. Right, so for instance, the before each would run before this describe, right, and then the teardown would run after these two run, and internally you can then just describe a before each for each one of the internal ones in here. So let's look at an extended example. Here's one. It's color-coded just so that we can follow along what's going on here. Notice that we're declaring a before all, which is going to just log one before all. And then we have here after all. Also, it's going to log after all. And notice that all these before all, after all, before each, and after each, they all have a 1. Okay? Right? And then a label, the correct label, before all, after all, before each, and after each. And then the actual test. Now this test is outside of the describe. Yes? So it's just its own thing. Its own thing. Whereas the describe here, we're going to try again, the same thing. Before all, after all, before each, and after each. And then a test inside of the describe. Make sense? All right, so if we run this, the first thing that's going to happen is that before all. Right? And that before all is going to be matched with the after all. Right, so that before all is the very first thing that's going to happen, and that after all is the very last thing that's going to happen. Okay? Whereas before each is going to run when? Well, it's going to run right before this test, and it's going to run right before this describe. And then this after each is going to run right after this test, and it's going to run right after this describe. Okay? Now when the describe runs, well, the describe is going to have before it is going to have a before each. Okay? And then after the describe is going to have an after each. But internally, when it's running, this test in here is going to have a before all, and right after, right before is going to have a before each, sandwich with an after each, and then an after all, and then a before, and then an after all. So anyway, I have a graphically displayed here, right? The matching of the before all matches with the after all, right? In yellow, and then we have the before each and the after each sandwiching our tests, our outside test, and then we have the inner test. Here's the inner test. The inner test has the inner before each and the after each, and the before all and the after all of that is inside of the describe. But then internally, it also has the before each and the after each, which were declared in the outside, right? Are declared right here. So this gives you a graphical representation of how these are nested, right, within each other as a sandwich, and what you would expect. Okay.